All right. Well, welcome everybody. It is that time. It is Tuesday evening for Come Follow Me. I'm Timothy Berman, and we are here. We are going to be discussing Genesis 42. I have with me, I don't know why I got.
Yeah, so we're doing 42 through 50, and this is the March 22, God meant it unto good lesson.
Yep.
Yeah, so I don't know, we've got LZ Scooby here tonight. It's been a while. Where have you been?
Busy with the little ones. We got 3 under 3, lots of different transitions and all that good stuff. So
yeah, you're probably going to be paying a lot in diapers on pull-ups.
Yeah. I went back to work. I was off paternity leave, so things have gotten my schedule has gotten way tighter. So
yeah,
Yes.
Totally understandable. Let's see. So we had put together a little slideshow. Well, a very long slideshow, Tim and I.
Yes.
I added a lot of stuff, probably more than I should, but there's so much in this lesson, and it's really hard to, at least for me, to like narrow it down or pare it down. But I'm really hoping that we can get to like chapters 48 through 50, because I really like those a lot. Like those are
Right.
my favorites. And we talked a lot last week, all the way up to pretty much the point where Joseph reunites with his brothers. And we did talk a lot about that in the previous lesson that we did last week. So I'm hoping we can kind of shift towards the end this week if you guys are good with that, because otherwise we'll be kind of repeating a little bit from last week. But what are your favorite parts? Who wants to go first? Scoobs, you want to do? Or Tim, you got some favorites?
go for it, Tim.
Well, I think for me, and I was thinking about this when I actually sat down and had some time to go through and read through the passages. What really stood out to me is the nature of betrayal and how do we deal with the betrayals that happen in our lives. And when you think of betrayals, you think of infidelity, you think of, but there's so many different types of betrayals. Um, in our workspaces, we can be betrayed by fellow coworkers or supervisor. We can be betrayed within our community, our faith base, and our fellowships. And so there's a lot to say about how do we deal with betrayal. And I think it's important for us to understand that and grapple with that, because many people who are church hurt, air quotes, usually is because of some form of betrayal, some form of unrealistic expectations that lead to a perceived betrayal, whether it was an actual betrayal or it was perceived to be a betrayal. And so it really speaks on how to deal with that, because it gives us this way to not just deal with it or manage it or cope with it, but to get into a space to where we can walk in forgiveness and walk in grace and walk in love and confront it for what it is, yet do it in a way that is loving and compassionate and honors both us, our faith, our relationships, and reconciliation. It's all about reconciliation and restoring those broken relationships because of betrayal. And I think that's a very huge thing that many people are probably dealing with and struggling with. That's just my thoughts and take on it.
Yeah, I would just add that, like, and I'll try to make it quick, but I had an experience on my mission. So my first two companions, one of them was fairly, I don't know, I have a good way to say it. He did not like North Americans at all. And so every day he reminded me that I would not be a good missionary, that I would never learn the language. And it was really, really difficult. And it was just really, really hard for me to like actually start my mission in Costa Rica, waking up to that every day. And I remember me and him almost got into a full on fight one morning. And I was like, in my 19-year-old brain, I was like, it would be worth it to go home hitting this guy. And clearly wrong, right? Just that's the 19-year-old brain. But that night, I remember studying my scriptures just right before bed. The overwhelming need to forgive him. And that was not from me. And it was really annoying because I was like, I knew that I needed to do that. And so I remember I said a prayer specifically. I will go and say I forgive him to his face, but I need your help to do that because that feels beyond my capability. I am that angry about this. And I felt the spirit, but it wasn't like this overwhelming thing. It was just kind of, go do your best. And I remember saying to him in the best Spanish I could muster, I forgive you for the things that you do to me, and I ask for your forgiveness for the things that I do to you. That was like, I remember switching between Spanish and English where I needed to because I just didn't have the vocabulary. And I remember him staring at me while he laid in his bed, and he started making snoring noises as if he didn't hear me. And I was like, my blood started to boil again, and I just hopped into bed. And I remember just in my night prayer, I just said, I did what you asked me to do. And I felt the anger leave. And I actually didn't have any more problems with him from my end from that time on, because I actually felt the atonement making up where I fell horribly short in my own heart. And so sometimes saying I forgive you to their face, even when you don't necessarily mean it or feel like capable of that, I felt, I feel the enabling power of the atonement, and it becomes real through the atonement. But it takes a lot to be able to look somebody in the eyes and tell them that you forgive them when you're that angry. But if you give it over to the Lord, he takes it.
Yeah. I've had plenty of times in my life where I've had to forgive, and it's really hard. And I think I'm pretty impressed actually with the way that Joseph was able to do that. Now, I will add that if I was a ruler on a throne, it would be a lot easier to forgive, I think. But sometimes it's hard when you're still in the pit to forgive. And I think that's kind of the time where, at least for me, I've had to really do, like you said, like plead with the Lord and give it to him, and many, many times. So
do you think that's why he stayed in the pit for an extra 2 years? Do you think he had to learn to forgive at the hardest time to do it, so that when he did receive power, he was merciful?
You mean Joseph, like just all their trials? I personally look at it as a descent phase. In fact, we talked about this last week, which is why I don't want to spend too much time on it, because we actually spent like 2 hours on this last week. But there's basically like a descent phase that he went through. It's pretty clear that that's what it was. And I can, if you guys want, I'll pull up the slides really quick and we can just kind of review. I'll scroll through them because it'll probably remind anyone who was watching last week. And then for you guys who weren't, you can kind of see just what we covered before. So let me pull that up.
Yeah, just in our Sunday school when we were going over it, somebody asked why, Joseph was already doing better. Why did he have to stay an extra 2 years? And I'm like, I think that's because that's what it required for Joseph to become who he became. Like the Lord didn't stunt his growth by letting him off easy. He's like, no, this is where you need to do it when the times are hard. Anyone can forgive. What you were saying, when you have the power and you're the second highest in all the land, it's easy to forgive then. But what if you're down in the pits? And I think Joseph needed that crucible moment to really become Joseph of Egypt. You know what I mean?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me flip that view so you guys can see this slide. Okay, so here's where we started last week. We kind of went through and just explained the lineage here. This is a continuation of the Abrahamic covenant through Joseph, the birthright son of Jacob and Rachel. And we talked about how there's actually a giant chiasm in this story, and how I feel like I'm getting like some feedback. Art, can you guys mute if you're not? And then there's this like center point here where in Genesis 45, 1-4, Joseph reveals himself and the whole family's reconciled. Now, this is like a pattern and like a prophecy. It's also a type of Christ, which we covered last week. And we spent probably the most time talking about that. We talked about how the Lord was with Joseph. This was like a drumbeat throughout the story. It's actually a Hebrew literary device. We discussed that. And then we talked about this descent and ascent, and how the story, the way that it's framed using these literary tools, really highlights these moments in the story so that you can see that he goes through very similar things that Jesus Christ goes through. And then we talked about that kind of, I don't know, divine election. We did this whole discussion about Cain and Abel and Esau and Jacob, and just all these different situations where you kind of have this like younger son being chosen over the older son, because it really comes down to righteousness. And the Lord often is doing something a little different than would be done in the natural man world, and because it pertains to righteousness. And then we talked about how out of the house of Israel come these two lines, one through Leah, one through Rachel. The one through Leah is the royal Davidic line. This is where King David descends and Jesus Christ descends. This is the one that is assigned government responsibility. And then we've got the birthright line, which is the ecclesiastical responsibility, or like the priesthood keys, if you will. And you see that this kind of turns into a prophecy, which is what I want to talk about tonight, because this is going to carry through and help us understand the signs of the times, the second coming, all the prophecies pertaining to it, what the role of the church is in the last days, and all those things. We talked a little bit about Judah and his transformation. We talked about repentance. We talked about the temple experience that it appeared Asenath has in mythology, because there's really only like one line about her in the Bible. I have some other slides we can look at later. We talked about Tamar's twins, Joseph's coat, this like ultimate fulfillment in the book of Revelation of all of these prophecies and how they're defined. We talked about the natural human pattern, which is where Judah, he makes a sacrifice that's selfish, and then he changes in the end, which is the part that we're going to be reading about tonight, which is the covenantal pattern. So initially, Judah, remember how he was the one who proposed selling his brother Joseph into slavery, and his motive for that sacrifice was selfish and self-preservation. But then in the end, after he goes through this whole repentance process, which Tamar helped him to recognize the hypocrisy in his life and even the error of his own ways, then in the end, you see how his story comes full circle. And the Joseph story is actually centered around Judah, which kind of makes sense because this is the Hebrew Bible. And who knows what the Nephites had? I don't know, but they had a Joseph story too. They might have different aspects of the story, but it's really focused on Judah and his redemptive arc, and how even he becomes a type of Christ when he goes to give us an unselfish sacrifice and offers himself as a permanent slave in place of Benjamin, which is Joseph's little brother, who is Rachel and Jacob's youngest son. She only had two sons that we know of, and then she died shortly thereafter. So Jacob was really attached to Benjamin, just like he was really attached to Joseph for a lot of reasons. And just to kind of recap the story, basically Joseph, when he finds out that he has this little brother and his brothers come to him seeking help during this time of famine, he wants them to bring Benjamin to him. And so he kind of does this little scheme to get them to have Benjamin, to like bring him there and then leave him there. And Judah offers himself in his place. And so you see a transformation in Judah. And ultimately it all comes down to, there's a lot of type of Christ motifs happening. There's lots of little hints at archetypes of Jesus Christ, what he looks like, and end time prophecies. And so we actually did this comparison between Joseph and Jesus specifically. There's also one you can do between Judah, which I just talked about. We talked a lot about like this kingship and the birthright and the priesthood and like the duties and government responsibilities kind of being separated between these two lines, and the ultimate fulfillment being Jesus Christ, who will have both of these. And then now we're back to this part, which is 42 through 50. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in this second half. And these are just some really cool slides that we put together. So I'll kind of scroll through. So this is 22 years later from the time that Joseph was first sold into slavery. The brothers are still carrying this guilt, which we'll see. And we've got that severe famine, which we talked about a little bit last week. Joseph, he's mature and powerful now. They don't recognize him. And this is kind of a typological thing for the end time. And it's also like a Christ motif in that the way he reveals himself to them. And then also there's kind of like a parallel between Joseph and the church, which I hope to be able to illustrate. But just like Joseph in Egypt, we all had lost our true identity, right? When we come into mortality. And then we have to come to know who we are, and then through that, who Jesus Christ is. And so there's kind of like a really cool, I don't know, theological thing you can think about there. And so we'll see how the hand of God is like in all of this, and it's really all pointing to Jesus Christ and the role that he plays in our lives. And we see those parallels here. Okay, there's your recap. And so we're going to be,
Thank you.
I want to focus on that. There's a lot in this, like a lot of really good stuff. And I actually did a super deep dive on Joseph's name too, that we can talk about, which is really
Hey, welcome, Latter-day Lion.
Yeah, you've been gone for a while too.
I know, I have a lot of family stuff behind the scenes going on, admittedly, but I'm back. We'll have some fun.
And we have a new guest panelist joining us tonight too.
Yes, so this is my friend. My friend Rachel. Sorry, I'm like stuttering tonight apparently. I think I'm having a problem with like my nerves. But she had a really cool thing that she had shared with me, and I just kind of last minute was like, hey, would you want to come and share this? Because it was really cool. And she did like a deep dive on the names, and found some really interesting, kind of beautiful little details that maybe what just happened?
Uh-oh.
Hang on, there we go. Somebody clicked something.
Thank you for your thought. Thank you for your thoughts, Rachel. That was the cane to drag you off stage.
There you go.
This is the benefits of going live, folks. Anything can happen.
Right.
Anyway, Rachel, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are.
Hi. So I'm a member of the church and just wanted to deep dive into what we're learning in Come Follow Me, because I'm a gospel doctrine teacher. And as I've been studying the scriptures the last few years, the names of places, I'm like, the Lord's been really impressing upon my mind. I need to study the names of places. And so I've been looking into, every time I read the scriptures, I look at the names and see what the meaning is. And it's just been mind blowing, the things that I've discovered from that. And so, but it's also like I'm noticing these parallels of the story in Genesis and how it is directly a prophecy of the restoration. Even down to, I was looking at this one the other day, and going through the story of Benjamin from Come Follow Me this week. You have so many things that happened with the saints in sequential order, in the scriptures. Like, here's a couple that I could just give off. I would have to go through the scriptures, like pull it up, read it together, and be able to see these things. If because I can't remember everything off the top of my head.
Do you want me to open up one of the chapters?
Oh gosh, like I have it all highlighted on my thing, and well, let's just talk about it step by step. So, and then maybe we can pull it up. I think it's Genesis 44 is what I was maybe. Anyway, but the gold that was hidden into the sacks of all of the 10 tribes, right? That I had this thought, gold equals gold plates. And then as I was reading through, I was just like, oh my gosh, step by step, all the events that it talks about in the story of Joseph of Egypt, if you read it with eyes to see and ears to hear, you see the restoration. The Bible is testifying of it right there in plain sight. Well, not plain sight. You kind of have to have it pointed out, but it's fascinating.
It's very typological.
Yes, yes, very much. But in a way that's like, once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. So let me just double check, because I have this. I might have to. I opened this up in Messenger, and I'm not sure how to get it to just open in another. Hold on, I might need to reconnect, and let me get that thing up so I can.
Do you want me to pull up Genesis, just those chapters, so we can look at it? Because I've got them open. If you want, I can put them on, and we can look.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get to where I can open it in my scriptures too.
Okay, let me share that.
Okay, let me get open here. Sorry, I was at my caucus meetings tonight, and
Good for you.
Through.
Big duty.
Oh, there was like 4 people that showed up because nobody cares in this year. They care at the presidential years.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're in section, I think it starts in section 43, actually. Yeah, so it's section 43. And so, let me see. Let me just see. So starting in section 40 or chapter 43, verse 23. And as I was reading this last night, I was like, okay, so they put the treasure in the sacks, and I was thinking money, like gold plates. And then in the next verse, 24, it says he gave them water and they washed their feet. Well, where do we see feet washing happening? Okay, so apostles, like we see that in the temple. And then the next verse, 25, that they should eat bread there. What is bread a reference to? We've got sacrament. And then it said into the house in the next verse, 26. Into the house they bowed himself to the earth. I guess I was kind of having this imagery of temples. And then if you skip down to verse 28, they're talking about how he is yet alive. And after the church was all set up, the apostles were called, and temples were starting to be built. We have that section in the Doctrine and Covenants that says that he lives. What is that verse? This is the testimony last of all, which we give, is that he lives. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, it keeps going on. I was like finding so many more things as I kept going. Skip down to verse 31. You see that it says set on bread. Okay. They wash their face and put the bread out. Bread is also a symbol of the sacrament. And then, let's see. Also, I got, okay. So sorry, I'm getting so sidetracked. It's so hard to explain all this because it's like, I'm like because learning about
really deep and she had a lot of good stuff.
Well, you have to, for this next thing, in order to understand it, you have to look at like the names of the 12 tribes and what the meanings of the names were.
So Rachel, tell us what you found about each name, because you had she had like a little picture. Maybe I can go save it out of the study group, and then I can put it up.
This extemporaneous, like impromptu, like trying to.
No, you're totally fine. I'm good at it. You're fine. You just talk. I'll go get it. I'll put it up.
Sure. But the meanings of the names of the brothers tell the story of the dispensations, like all of them. And even into the meridian of time, the middle brother, when you get to that.
Can you do Joseph's last? Brother. Because when you do Joseph's, I want to pull up some slides that I have on it.
Yeah, great. So, let's see. Sorry, it's making me re-enter the thing again, because let's see, enter studio.
I'm actually really interested to see what you'll say about this, because Jessica has been talking up the names and the meanings of the sons of Israel for over a year to me. And I've been dying to actually watch this episode, and I'm
So
happy to be on it.
And I found her little picture that she did. She's done like some really cool little pictures and like diagrams. Okay, here's the one where she did all of the here, I'm gonna save this to my phone and then I'm gonna pull it up for you guys, where she actually made like little AI pictures that just kind of it's like an infographic, and it's really cool because it shows all the names of them. And yeah, hold on, let me get these pulled up in my Google Drive really quick so that we can look at them, because she spent a lot of time on them and I could tell that she put a lot into this and it was really, really awesome. Okay,
Yeah,
so I'm gonna upload
usually
those.
when people try to bring something up like this, like the expectation is kind of like, oh, you're gonna make surface level things, but like I know Jessica has been talking this up for well
I've
over
done
a
a
year.
30-minute presentation on this, so there's no surface anything there.
I mean, it's level just to make it there, and I know it's not going to be that, so it's like.
Okay,
I'm
so
excited.
let me stop sharing this really quick, and then let me share a different. I'm going to pull it up on my Google Drive really quick. Just those pictures that she had.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I didn't have it up on the right thing, and yeah.
You're fine. Okay, so let me see if I've got the pictures in here. Okay, so here's one of them. And let me see if I've got the other one. Okay, so I just want to make sure I have them all.
Hey, and as a quick side note thing,
Yes,
Rachel,
I
I have a question to ask you once the camera's off about your caucus meeting.
Okay.
Because
Yeah, I love that feature,
I
right?
think you may
Yeah.
have met my brother-in-law and sister. So
Oh, okay.
Just off of the clues of things you've said.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Sounds good.
so okay, I think I've got it. So let me share
Okay.
this screen now, and then Rachel, you can talk about what you put together. That is really cool. So here's Google Drive. Okay, so let's look at this cool infographic that she made. Okay, so here's the first one. Rachel, do you want to talk about those ones?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So I got this idea. I was like, it's really weird what Joseph's name means. And when you look at I just started looking, I'm like, I got to find out some sort of symbolism here. So I noticed that Reuben was see a son. And then when I looked at Simeon's name and it said herd, I was kind of like had this thought come to my mind about when it says, because we just recently studied Noah, about how the Lord remembered Noah. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. When we're heard, like when we're remembered, there's a kind of a connection there. But then Levi, I was noticing like everything about Levi, like about the name Levi joined, it was screaming to me about Abraham. For some reason, I'm like, wait, that's when the covenant family was joined together. And then I got thinking about it further. Judah, oh, it means praise. Well, this is when Moses and all of the Egyptians first learned to praise the Lord. Like the same God of Abraham that had saved him, and then I was like, well, what happened after that? The judges. And I was shocked. I saw that Dan's name meant judge. And I was like, well, the reign of the judges right there. Israel's established. We have the judges. But then Naphtali, they started to have the wrestlings with each other. They had the civil war of the north and the south, and the Babylonians and the Assyrians coming in and taking over. And they had this great wrestle. Do you have the second one up?
Yeah, hold on. Let me grab that one because it was out of order. So I think that was this
And
one.
really quick before you go, I think this is
it is.
interesting because the stories of the children of Israel here, like Jacob and stuff, date to around the time of Joshua, which means that we're moving into prophetic future events for this analogy to continue on to be telling the stories of dispensations. This extends beyond the time period in which it's written. So it truly has a prophetic nature to what she's saying moving forward from this.
Yeah, and when Jacob does his thing from like Genesis 48 to 50, this is going to come up in Exodus again later too. So we want to pay attention to that.
Yeah, definitely. Totally. And then you think about Gad is the next one. and fortune. Well, what was the greatest fortune? Like Christ being born into the world was a great fortune. And of course, all of us were able to become happy once he was resurrected. And the next, sequence of what happens later. Well, we have we do have the apostasy, but then there's this reward that is gained because people were still trying to maintain the faithfulness even with apostasy in the Reformation. We had people who were moved on by the Spirit of the Lord that had all of this knowledge given to them. And then, we know that that's when the saints, or not the saints, but the ancestors of the saints, the pilgrims and the covenant, the lost covenant family coming across over to the Americas for a new dwelling. But then you get to Joseph, and it says, he will add. And what is the one thing our church is constantly made fun of for Joseph Smith doing? Oh, he added to the Bible.
We
But
took
it's
away.
interesting.
Oh, yeah, right, Ed.
Yeah, because right. And it's interesting because it's like God is literally saying that through Joseph of Egypt, that God will add, that God is going to give something here.
And I have more on this one, so let's do Benjamin and then let's go back to Joseph because I
Okay,
actually
sounds
have an
good.
even deeper dive. It's going to blow your mind, I swear it will.
Oh, I'm so excited.
That's great.
So then I got thinking, I was like, well, Joseph is the era in which we've been here. The church has been established and everything's good. And then you start reading the story that we're reading in Come Follow Me about this week about how the Lord didn't show his face until Benjamin was brought. Benjamin had to be brought. Benjamin had to be tried. And that was when the Lord revealed himself, when Judah stepped in place for Benjamin, which we know that Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, is in the Middle East, in that land of Israel, as well as the tribe of Judah. They stayed there. They were able to return after the Babylonian exile. And I guess I was kind of thinking it's just odd, with everything going on. There must be something there with Iran and the events going on in Iran that maybe Benjamin being brought, this is the last key thing before the Lord comes, that somehow that's connected to Iran and Israel somehow. And I'm not exactly sure how, because the events are still playing out. But it's just interesting that Benjamin, it's son of the right hand. And so I don't know. I
Well,
see
and
a big second
it
coming
might have
narrative
something
there.
to do with the millennial reign too, because Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
he is the son of the right hand, and I think that it does kind of signify that period.
Mm-hmm.
And then I really like that name Benjamin. So my little brother who died, his name was Benjamin, and I remember I had this dream about him, and I'm not going to share it because it's like really personal, but
Mm-hmm.
there was all this imagery in this dream, and I had it more than once. And so I started praying about it and trying to understand it. I even went so far as to talk to a lady who had written an article in the Ensign many years ago about dreams. And I reached out to her and I talked to her on the phone about it, and she gave me some good advice for ways that I could approach it. And sure enough, eventually I realized that the answer was in the name and the meaning of the name. So I'm all about
Wow.
this kind of study approach. I think that it can
Mm-hmm.
really help with our understanding of the gospel. So that said, do you guys care if I flip over to the Joseph name now?
Can I say one more thing quickly?
Yeah, go
And
for
that
it.
is with Benjamin, it's very interesting because who is the leader of Israel right now? Benjamin
Oh yeah.
Netanyahu. So I made that connection, and so I feel that Benjamin. We also know that in section, what is it, 68 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that talks about how the Jews eventually will be basically taking over the church and the priesthood. As I understand, I don't know. I'm still kind of
Well, we
studying
talked
about that,
about
but
the
it
two
talks about the
scepters.
Jews
We
having
talked about the
that.
two scepters. So
Right,
Joseph
right.
has the ecclesiastical, and
Yeah.
then Judah has the governmental. And this is part of that promise that was given to them anciently, and this is a prophecy. It is an end time
Yeah.
prophecy, and Isaiah speaks to this. So
Yeah.
there's more about Joseph's name though, and I think this is really interesting. There was actually a rabbi that I was seeing talking about this the other day with Kerry Milstein on his channel, and he pointed out one extra thing that isn't really known. If you look up all of the information that we have on this name, there's one little tidbit that he noted that's kind of more internal in Judaism, but it's the idea that you add by gathering. Okay, so Joseph, like the way that you add is by gathering. So it's the idea of multiplication. And I've got all the information about adding and multiplication, but this idea of gathering is part of that. And that was like the extra thing that I picked up recently that I was like, okay, that makes sense because of all the other information that I'd already had collected on this name. And I wanted to show some really cool just stuff that I'd found on this. So let me share this other screen with you guys. And maybe we can do a little deep dive here on Joseph in Egypt and just some of what we can learn about him through studying his name.
And really quick before you start that, I just wanted to point out, like, how many times we say something like that, like it's multiplying by adding. At the end of the Doctrine and Covenants, come follow me. Like, like section 128 and on, we said that so many times. And I don't know if it's just how come follow me functions, that it meant to dovetail back into the Old Testament, but it, like, at no point have I felt like there was a stop and we were like, okay, let's go back to Genesis 1. It was like, no, this is a continuation, the restoration, and it's almost like it's one eternal round. Oh my.
No, it is, and it's because it's the two points, right? And this is that two scepters, the two bookends. It's the eternal round circle idea. And I think that the Doctrine and Covenants, this is just my personal opinion, but I actually think it has more to do with the Old Testament than the Book of Mormon or the New Testament. That's just me. I see so much Old Testament there.
I would agree.
And I think that the Book of Mormon also has a lot of Old Testament in it. I mean, it's more of an Old Testament book than it is a New Testament anything. Like,
all the way up until 3rd Nephi 11,
exactly,
when Christ comes and literally says, here's the New Testament and New Covenant that I'm making with you. Like, it's a significant portion of the Book of Mormon as well.
Yes.
You mean like we start with a two covenant family, like a male and a female, kind of Adam and Eve, Lehi, Sariah. That's what you're referencing, right? And then the way it plays out, they're in a boat, the flood, Noah's Ark. Yeah, it's very Old Testament.
So here's the prophecies that are tied with Joseph's name. Okay, we're going to talk about the vine stretching beyond the wall. We're going to talk about all of that. And starting with Joseph being connected to the blessing of the breast and the womb. This is something that Isaiah prophesied. You will see this in the Doctrine and Covenants. This has to do with the bride-bridegroom motif. And it also has to do with kind of like that father to son patriarchal priesthood. It is both a man and a woman role. The church essentially becomes a foster father and a nursing mother to the house of Israel through the Ephraimite Gentiles who receive the gospel in the end time. And we have here a little concordance that I pulled just on Joseph's name. This was kind of my first layer of study. We see how Judah is that Messiah line, Levi is the priesthood line in the Exodus story. And then we've got Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh who are for gathering. This is that increasing, adding upon. And this is like a super important motif to understand. You're going to see that theme. It was all throughout the Doctrine and Covenants. You'll see it in the Book of Mormon. The righteous remnant that's preserved is that dispensation of Lehi. And he is the one of those branches. There's like a lot of feedback. Can somebody, I don't know, can you guys mute if you're not muted? And then
I was hoping if I can interject here for a moment, because one of the things that I came across, and I've mentioned this before in our lives, in our discussions, Matthew 19, when you go towards the end of it, Christ says that the first shall be last and last shall be first. And then you go to Matthew 20 and it opens up with the parable of the vineyard, the laborers in vineyard. And then he ends that parable by stating again, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Who was the first to hear the gospel? The Jews. Who are the last to hear the gospel? The Gentiles. And so when Christ says the first shall be last and the last shall be first, he's speaking directly to all of this that we're talking about today, the literal gathering of the house of Israel in the last days.
Yeah, and he's also speaking about that pattern playing out again. So like we've received the gospel first now in this last dispensation, and in this last dispensation all the things that played out in those previous dispensations that were pertinent are going to play out again in this dispensation. And so that mantle is going to be passed again, and that's that idea, but they're going to come together in Jesus Christ. And so here's the prophecy. So Joseph's name also means to not just to add and to increase and to gather, but it also means to do again. And this really speaks to the restoration period. We're doing again what was done before. This is a restitution and restoration of all things. And so this is a bunch of information that I pulled on this. He has a very, very nuanced name, but it basically implies repetition or continuation. And this idea of, again, repeating something that's embedded in the meaning of the root word for his name. And so this is where you can kind of see how the restoration really speaks to this. The fact that Joseph Smith's name, like the name Joseph, was called out in the Book of Mormon, and his link back to Joseph in Egypt is totally divine design. Like this is God's hand in this work. And I think you can see it when you study the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants.
On that topic, really quick, just to interject, to do again, this is before the law of Moses. So the law of Moses is fulfilled in Christ, but these covenants predate the law of Moses, which means these things are very much still in effect despite the atonement having been fulfilled. So when people say all the time, well, Jesus, it was the final revelation, it's finished, all the work is done. It's like, no, the law of Moses was fulfilled. There are still covenant promises that will continue to move forward. And that's why it's so important to believe that there is modern revelation, that God still speaks with his children, because these things are still rolling forward as have always been predicted from Genesis. Like
he's still the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Yeah.
It doesn't change.
The fulfillment of the law of Moses does not override Abrahamic covenants.
And
it's a
Jesus
subcategory.
Instituting the New Testament, that didn't override everything either. It fulfills everything.
Correct.
One of the things that I found interesting going over the slides that you presented, Jessica, and putting everything together. And again, I appreciate you doing that.
And I'm going to pull those up too later after we go through the name.
But there's an interesting connection I made with all of this that we're talking about is the unifying of Joseph with how do you say her name?
Asenath.
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 Yeah. Asenath.
When I looked up the pronunciation, it said Asenath.
Asenath. Yeah. So the unification, the marital covenant between Joseph and Asenath, and you pointed out that Asenath represents the Gentile church.
Yeah.
And so there's this marriage covenant that happens with the house of Israel and the Gentiles, that we are being brought into a covenantal marriage under the atonement with Jesus Christ.
And so we're doing that to be added upon, right? The adding.
Right. And that's why he says, other sheep I have not that are not of this fold, I must also go and teach, so that they shall come in and then there shall be one fold and one shepherd. And
he was talking about all of these lost tribes, right? Like in the New Testament, Christ is talking about the Nephites who he goes and appears to in 3rd Nephi. And in 3rd Nephi, he says the same thing to them. And he's talking about all these other lost tribes that we don't have a record of, but someday we will. Right. And so this is all those 3 branches. Okay, so in Jacob chapter 5, it talks about 3 spots of ground and 3 branches that are scattered over these 4 parts of where the Lord comes in, and it's divided by the Lord coming to check on his vineyard 4 times. And so it divides it up into 5 parts. The very last part is where we're at. It's like maybe verse, I don't know, like 72, 73, somewhere in there. That's what we're experiencing now in terms of the historical part of that story. And that is this part. It's this part where we're gathering, we're adding, we're increasing, and we're receiving. There's this double fruitfulness that is inherent in Ephraim's name. So this is where we get into Joseph's 2 sons. And this is important because this all ties into the house of Joseph. Because remember, he's the birthright son, so he gets a double portion. The way that Israel ends up giving this is he has Joseph's portion divided between Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, the work in the end time is also between Ephraim and Manasseh. Lehi was of Manasseh, and the Ishmael that Lehi brought with him for his sons to have wives, he was of Ephraim. And so you have these two branches of Joseph that are preserved over in America through the Book of Mormon. And then later, when they meet up with the Mulekites, this brings in Judah because he was of the tribe of Judah. So you have at least these three main tribes over preserved in the Book of Mormon, land and time. And that seed is preserved. And so this is like a really cool kind of, I don't know, just like a preservation story. It's like God's hand at work. He's constantly preserving a remnant of this house to keep these promises that are made anciently to these fathers. And so the meaning of Ephraim's name, who is the son of Joseph, it comes from this Hebrew root parah, which means to be fruitful or to bear fruit. Joseph's name, he names his second son Ephraim because, quote, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction, he said in Genesis 41:52. Ephraim can be understood as meaning double fruitfulness or fruitfulness in abundance, which ties into the idea of increase or multiplication. And so this seed of Ephraim, these are all kind of like the little scriptures noted here where you can kind of see like just different places where it's mentioning the prophecies that pertain to Ephraim. And so these are the kings and queens of the Gentiles who are going to carry and lift the house of Israel in the end time. And so it's going to fulfill that Joseph motif where he unites the house of Israel and then Christ will appear. And
What's
so
interesting too, Jessica, is that we have a double portion as Ephraim, the Bible and the Book of Mormon.
yes,
Feels
the
to
two
me
sticks.
like that's our double
And we've got a
portion.
slide for that too. Yes.
Nice.
Well,
That's so cool.
well,
And
one
so
of
many
the
things you said, like about the Judah and the Ephraim and Manasseh. I literally had that thought yesterday, and so you're just confirming, like, that's so cool.
well,
Yeah,
one
so
of the things,
go
one
ahead,
of the
Tim, talk. I'm going to scroll through these.
yeah, one of the things that I find very interesting is that, and I didn't realize this until this past couple years. When you look at the Abrahamic covenant, one of the promises was land of inheritance. Now, according to the narrative within the Genesis account, Abraham literally had to walk the border of what would become Israel. Yet the covenant is talking about land, the land of inheritance. When the Jewish diaspora was fulfilled in 70 AD, and the house of Israel, the Jews were scattered throughout all of the world, one of the things that's going to happen with the gathering of Israel is that they're not going to come into one specific land. They're going to come into their lands of inheritance, that there's multiple lands of inheritance.
It's actually the whole earth in the end. Like
The
it'll be the
entire
whole earth.
yeah, the whole earth. So
But specifically,
they
the
are going to
American continent was the one that was given to Joseph. And
right.
there's also a place in Israel that was given to him and his posterity. And so that was actually in this previous slide. So there's just kind of like a mention there in Genesis 48. This is one of the chapters that we studied, and it's about how just Ephraim and Manasseh, remember how Jacob crossed his hands over, and this carries forward that same motif where a younger son is receiving the birthright. And you remember how Jacob, remember everything he went through with his mother, Rachel, or not Rachel, but Rebecca, when she was talking to Isaac, and she was kind of like, hey, trying to help Isaac see that Jacob is the one who should be the rightful heir, not Esau. Well, think about that story, because you can tell that it has influence over him here as he's about to bless these two grandsons. And Joseph's like, oh, no, wait, Dad, no. Manasseh's the older son. And Jacob's like, no, I know where this is supposed to go. And you just see this like beautiful continuation of a lesson that he learned from his mother, and about righteousness and the importance of it, and listening to that revelation, that personal revelation that you receive. And it's amazing. It's amazing how these people are so in tune with the Spirit. And so,
And you see that with the women too, that
yes,
Leah.
well, it was his mother's vision that taught him that. And
Yeah.
it's so cool that she like had this beautiful vision. And then even in the way that he names his sons, like he renamed Benjamin, because remember, Rachel had named him, I think it was Ben-Oni, and it was like son of sorrow, but then Jacob changed it to Benjamin, which is son of the right hand. And so there's this prophecy contained in here, and this idea of the fullness of the Gentiles, this actually goes back to these patriarchal blessings. So this phrase, fullness of the Gentiles, that's in Romans 11:25, it's primarily a New Testament concept, but you'll see that theologically it links back to these promises that are given to Ephraim. So Paul uses this phrase in the context of the inclusion of the Gentiles into God's covenant people. And remember, Asenath is the one who kind of represents that Gentile bride because she was Egyptian, she converted, she goes through in the myth what sounds like some kind of temple endowment in preparation for Joseph to marry her, and then she's brought into this covenant. And so it kind of signifies God's covenant people, including the Gentiles in the end time, and signifying that there'll be a time when the fullness of the Gentiles comes into the family of God, which is what Tim was just talking about. So this is seen as related to this blessing of Ephraim, where he'll become a multitude of nations. This comes from that word melo hagoyim. This term, it's been interpreted by some scholars and theologians to anticipate the inclusion of Gentiles specifically, connecting back to the root of the idea of fullness and fruitfulness that we talked about a second ago. And so think about like the leaven sprinkled throughout all the nations. This was the scattering of Israel, but it served the purpose for the end time, which is what we're living in now. And so you can see how that scattering turns into a blessing. What was a covenant curse becomes a covenant blessing in the end through restoration and repentance. And so then and that's what the Joseph story was about, right? Restoration and repentance, forgiveness. And so there's some other scriptures here that I noted that have to do with this fullness of the Gentiles and just what these things mean about these like grafting in of natural branches to this mother tree. You can go back to Jacob 5. You can look at that just kind of in a new light. There's actually a Seminary Institute diagram that you can look up about it that divides it all up into its parts so that you can identify very clearly which verses are talking about which time period. And the majority of it talks about our day. And so here's Manasseh, and this is important too because
question.
Go ahead. What's up?
So when you look at the women in this story, because this is the first time we actually really get some information about women. Usually it's more like they're a passing thought, like Eve. Unless you actually get in and really study Eve, you don't really get a whole lot of information. Yet with Leah, with Rebecca, with Rachel, all these women, we have all this information. My question is, doesn't this point to the reality of the divine feminine, the divine motherhood, the divine covenant with the women that we see play out in scripture that most of us probably miss when we go through and we read these?
I'd love to speak to
Well,
that
I think
because that's
it
something
does.
I've really looked into. Because I'm a second wife. Like my husband was married before, and so like when I was reading these the last time we studied Old Testament, I noticed this huge theme with the women, and I was always noticing that the second wife was the one that the covenant went through, not the first wife. And Leah, she was married first, but she was not favored. It was the second wife that was favored and yet was not able to have children for so long. And you see the same struggle with Hannah later in the scriptures with Samuel when Samuel was born. There's another restoration parallel there with Samuel to Joseph Smith. And so it's like there's this theme with Leah and Rachel of the first shall be last, last shall be first. But then you also have this second wife theme. And you also see it with the second brother. It's always the second brother, like you were talking about with Ephraim and Manasseh. You see it with Nephi and Laman and Lemuel. You see it with so many of these brothers in scripture that it's the second one or the younger brother. It's the second wife, not the first wife. And we see that it wasn't Christ's church when it was instituted by him on the earth. It was the Latter-day Church. So yeah, there's some very interesting parallels we learn when we look at these women and not just see them as a passing thought.
Well, and I think that there's actually like a little bit of a chiasm there because like just in the marriages themselves, because you have Abraham who had plural wives, but then you have Isaac who just had Rebecca. And then you have Jacob, who had plural wives. Both Abraham and Jacob, they had some worldly interventions that kind of like put them in these really difficult situations. But with Isaac, it's like more of the ideal. And I think that's really interesting. But there's also some feminine motif going on in this name of in Joseph's blessing. And so I want to point that out. And before I do, I want to just note Manasseh's role, because remember, these all go back to the house of Joseph and to the house of Israel. And so this brother Manasseh, who was supposed to receive the birthright, he was the first son, but it was Ephraim that Israel ends up giving the birthright to through his own revelation. And so this is very interesting, but this verb nashah means to forget. And so it either means like to lend on like interest, or to forget, or rather to have like a memory that slowly evaporates away. Well, there's this noun, nashia, which means forgetfulness or oblivion. These are all part of the root of his name. And then this other noun, nashi, which means debt. And so this noun, mashishi, I'm not sure how to say that, means loan, and is spelled identical to the following, which is to carry, this verb nasa. So it describes this like upward motion too, which generally is something that's being pulled out at like when you're trying to remove it. And this verb occurs very often and can usually be translated in these three ways: to lift or lift up, to bear or carry, or to take or take away. And so I just like this verse in Isaiah 49:22, because you see it there. I will lift up my hand to the nations, raise my ensign to the peoples, and they will bring your sons in their bosoms and carry your daughters on their shoulders. And so you see how there's this branch that was broken off, but it will be remembered in the covenants of the Lord in the end time. And you see that in 2 Nephi 3:4. And so think about, you were talking about the names, Rachel. So think about how Ephraim and Manasseh, they really do describe the modern church, the role that it plays, what's happening in this time that we live in now.
Well, let's not forget that when you look at, because Ephraim and Manasseh are actually Joseph's sons, and so they're the grandsons of Jacob.
Yeah, and so this is the blessing of the breast and the womb that is given there.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, and the reason I bring that up, is because in a way, Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh to become his sons.
Yeah.
And that speaks to how the Gentiles are being adopted into the covenant with the house of Israel. And so the church is being adopted into this divine relationship, in this covenantal relationship.
Well, and Joseph Smith was actually a rightful heir too. And this is an important thing to remember. He was an actual Ephraimite. So this is very important to the story. And that's what the Book of Mormon prophesied, right? Like the Book of Mormon talks about Joseph being a real literal descendant of Joseph in Egypt, which we know is through Ephraim because of just all of these other church history things that are kind of a tangent. But going back to Joseph, this blessing of the breast and womb. So Genesis 49:25 is where we start seeing this. But there's these, when you break down the words here, you've got this blessing, which is barakah, and then you've got of the breast, which is shad is breast. And then I thought this was interesting too, because in Arabic, like when you look at Isaiah 66:11, where this word is used, this also is like the consolations of Jerusalem. And then the womb, which also comes from this word compassion. And so that means compassion. And I thought that was really interesting. And then you also get, so here's that Isaiah 66:11, the KJV, that ye may suck and be satisfied with the breasts of her consolations, that ye may milk out and be delighted with the abundance of her glory. So there's a lot of like feminine motif going on with these blessings of the breast and the womb. And I pulled the Isaiah Institute translation too, just because it used the word nurse. And at her consoling breast, draw at your pleasure from the abundance of her bosom. And remember that the word draw ties back to the well, to that well where you had the woman at the well, you've got Rachel at the well, you had Rebecca at a well. So there's this like idea of the living water, the milk that is given but remember that the mother has to eat the meat to give the milk. And so this is kind of like a really interesting teaching that's happening here about this role that Ephraim plays and
which
the
makes
descendants
sense.
of Joseph.
Which makes sense because when you look at the Old Testament, especially when you get into more of the minor prophets, there is a recurrent pattern of a call to repentance. It's never the Lord calling the sons of Zion or the sons of Jerusalem to come to repentance. It's, oh, daughters of Zion, oh, daughters of Jerusalem. So he's speaking to the feminine, and that makes sense because who's the one that is more compassionate, more caring when it comes to forgiveness and repentance, showing divine mercy. If that makes, I mean, I could be totally off base here.
Well, I think it goes back to the bridegroom motif too, and the role of the church. And so here you have Genesis 49, 22 through 26, which is part of our lesson. And this is kind of paraphrased a little bit, but Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. So there's that same imagery, whose branches run over the wall. And I want to get to this branches thing because this was like a cool thing that came up this time around. I don't even have it in my original presentation, but I'm going to do like maybe a follow-up video later just to add it because it was so cool. So it talks about the archers. This is another motif. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's super cool. You can look at it later. But it talks about how these branches run over the wall. And this is a very important idea about the gathering of Israel in the end time, and even the scattering of Israel, because this happened with the scattering that these branches can run over this wall. So then you have like these arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. And it says, even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee. Remember that idea of helper, helpmeet, the help. And by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven, above blessings of the deep that lieth under blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors under the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. So this is like a really cool end time prophecy. And you can kind of start to see the fulfillment of the house of Israel being restored, or Article of Faith number 10. And this gets brought in Deuteronomy too, which we're going to get to. So I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but I just want you to look at the same verbiage that's being used there. You've got that fullness, you've got brought forth, which is a whole motif that's happening here. You have put forth. So all of this is tied to Ephraim and Manasseh. See how that verse ends? The 10,000s of Ephraim and the thousands of Manasseh. And so then here's more of that motif. You can see it in Psalms. You can see it in Isaiah again. You have the foster fathers and queens, your nursing mothers. So kings shall be your foster fathers, queens, your nursing mothers. The KJV just says nursing fathers and nursing mothers, which is super bizarre and weird, but I think this translation is probably more correct. And so it makes more sense that it's a foster father and nursing mother. But we have this also, I pulled some pseudepigrapha too. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but just trying to show how that motif carried over even into these pseudepigraphical texts. So this is like fourth book of Maccabees and that forgotten books of Eden, which is like a myth. But it's all there. That same motif is there, talking about these promised blessings in the end. And so this is a theme throughout the Bible, a theme throughout definitely the Doctrine and Covenants, which we talked about last year. And so I'm going to kind of skip through this, but basically there's this eschatology context for the fullness of the Gentiles. And it has like layers. There is the prophecy that has to do with the fullness of the Gentiles. It kind of has it's like a double-edged sword. It's basically like the fullness of iniquity and the fullness of righteousness, and that kind of separation that happens. And so here's the part that I just wanted to get to that is super cool. So when you look at Joseph's name and you look at that like fruitfulness and like reaching beyond the wall, notice how the fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well whose branches run over the wall, depending on which translation you're looking at, you can get some different ideas, but being fruitful is usually pertained to like a feminine motif. And it often is tied to this idea of well, spring, living water, nursing, all of those things. And then when you go to look up this word, like the part that says whose branches, this is actually a feminine plural, and it actually has this root in the idea of a daughter. And I love this because you're talking about that heavenly mother kind of divine feminine archetype. It is right here in this motif and in this blessing. And so for me, I'm just sitting here like, when are we going to learn more about this? That's what I'd like to know, because I am dying to find out more about these things and this like special role. And I feel like with Joseph Smith, we talked last year about how when he brought in the Relief Society, this was kind of like his idea of, you know, the fullness of that priesthood order coming together. And I feel like you see it right here. It's all prophesied. It's right there in the Bible, everything that's been happening. And so I just really love that, because I mean, look at that. Daughters step over the wall. I mean, this is like the season for women, you guys. Like, ladies,
Yeah.
President Kimball wasn't joking when he was like, hey, women of the church. And President Nelson repeated that. So there were two witnesses there. And he was asking the women of the church to step up and understand their priesthood power and roles and responsibilities. And it's all right here in the name Joseph, in the blessing of the breast and the womb, with the daughters stepping over the wall. So there you go.
I
So
think it's interesting what you said about wall too, because wall, there's actually a reference in Hebrew of understanding wall means it can mean barrier, not just like a wall, like how we think of a wall of being upright. And so when looking at wall, I mean, it's like we're getting past the barriers that we have in front of us as women. But also like thinking of the divine feminine in terms of that we, the church, we nurture the Lord's children. We are also an archetype of this. And so anytime in scripture, lately I've just been reading, anytime it's a story about a woman, I look at that story as that's a story about the church and me as a member of the church. And what can I learn about the divine feminine within me reading this story of this woman and this relationship? The man, if I think of the man in scripture as Christ, and of course you don't want to take this too far because it you know, but if you look at these stories and you see that the man, like you take the story of Ruth and Boaz as an archetype of Christ, Ruth as an archetype of the church, there is so much to learn from that.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite stories. And I identify with Ruth quite a bit because I feel like that's been my own personal journey in my life. And so when we get to that one, I'll maybe share stuff about that. But look
So
here
can
on
I,
this slide.
can I share
This
something really quick on
summarizes
that?
what I just said. Yeah.
So recently had the chance to hear from, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to be sharing this, but heard from Aaron Sherarian, who's the church communication director. They were talking a lot about just missionary efforts and, you know, the plan for the next 10 years and whatnot. And they found that there's officially more sister missionaries than there are elders currently serving. And they don't see that ever going back.
That's interesting.
Moving forward, he was able to share some of that data.
Well, that's totally this right here where it says right here in this like translation, notice like right here, this branches, and then how in this Young's literal translation, it says Joseph is a fruitful son by a fountain. Daughters step over the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting because it talks about the wings were given unto the woman. So part of me wonders like how,
and
like
those were in the Osmith story.
Yeah, like how much more about priesthood can we come to understand in the coming years, and the women really taking off with wings of power through the priesthood. You know, like learning how to use it as women. We as women use and function in the priesthood.
Right, and I think that there's a way that it can enhance our gifts.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll try to find you like something to support that, but I heard it straight from the horse's mouth that that's like something that the brethren are very conscious of, and they don't anticipate elders outnumbering the sisters in the missionary field moving forward.
Wow.
Which is crazy, cool. Which actually speaks directly to what you're saying here, which, you know, we've already been saying everything in the restoration has something within Genesis right here. And you know, that who knows if that's actually the connection or not, but it's one of those things where it's like, oh no, that makes perfect sense. I just heard the communications director say that same thing. So interesting.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, I like that. So these are the slides that me and Tim had put together, and they're really cool too. And I'm going to scroll through them because I actually had like 60 of these, which is like way too many to talk about. But I'm just going to scroll so you guys can see, because we put together a lot of themes for what was going on in these chapters. And I feel like there were some really beautiful themes that were pulled out. Like this was really cool too. Just like the sons of Jacob were receiving their blessings. You can think about your patriarchal blessing, what the promises, what the gifts, what all the things are, and just how these are eternal and how the blessings can cover a very long eternity. And I really love how I don't know, I think that I see this because look at how long ago these blessings were given, and then how some of the promises are coming about thousands of years later.
Well, and that's something to kind of look at as we close out Genesis. What is Genesis overall, really, if not like a kind of a 1,000 foot high bird's eye view of what the Abrahamic covenant is? And as we go throughout the rest of the Torah, the rest of the 5 books of Moses, we're going to see that come into fruition, and how well throughout the rest of the Old Testament, how well, especially the tribe of Judah in particular, lived up to that covenant, and what that ultimately means for us in the last days.
Well, I mean, right now, we are the branches that are reaching over the wall. There is a multitude of nations receiving the gospel. We are crossing that distance. The Americas were reserved for this remnant. The gospel has exploded here. You have North and South America just covered with temples, and they're starting to dot the whole earth too. And
Well,
so I
and
do,
what land was given to Joseph as an inheritance?
it was North and South America, which
North
is
and
what
South
I'm
America.
saying.
There
It's
you
like
go.
you can see the fruitfulness and the double fruitfulness, and how there's that idea of those branches reaching
Right.
beyond the walls. And so this is right here. This is an illustration of what needs to happen. This is what needs to happen in order to complete that prophecy. And I think that this is kind of like that idea where we're talking about those two scepters. The gospel needs to come from this land over to the old land, and the full house of Israel needs to be restored. And remember, there was that beautiful scene with Joseph and Judah and his brothers making amends in the end of this story. And I think that it's interesting that it closes with this idea and then these promised blessings, because here's that pattern, here's that chain, dispensations and how they're connecting. Here's those double portions, the two sticks, right? The sticks can be both the Book of Mormon and the Bible, but it's also talking about people. I mean, it's literally talking about people. Like if you really dig into it, it's actually not just talking about Book of Mormon and Bible. It's actually talking about people. And we are the marvelous work and wonder. Not the Book of Mormon, we are. The Book of Mormon is the tool for gathering. And so
Well,
there's this beautiful gathering of Israel.
well, one thing I want to point out is, look at South Africa right now. It is exploding with new memberships.
Yeah, and
I mean,
this is
worldwide, there's a lot of new memberships going on, but South Africa seems to be growing in membership.
this is that. Remember last week, guys, I showed you my old slide for this. I made a new one just because I wanted to, because it was fun. I was having fun with this, like too much fun. And so I made a new one, and like it turned out really good because it shows how I had found like this really interesting theme in the biblical numbers for Rachel and for the years that Jacob had worked. And you see that idea of double fruitfulness playing out here too. And she's the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. And so it's a theme that keeps happening, and I feel like it keeps pointing back to the same thing. It's this like modern day, the Gentiles receiving the gospel in the end time, and they need to bring it back to the house of Israel that was scattered, and they need to gather them back in. And you see that in Asenath's name. We talked a little bit about this last time. Her name means city of refuge. This totally has the Zion motif, like the city of Zion motif. And it has all of the like typology that you would want to see to be able to understand the restoration in her name. And so these were some of the things that we pulled out of the myths that we were talking about last week. But again, double fruitfulness, the daughters reaching beyond the walls. I feel like it's a season of restoration. I mean, that is the season we live in. It's the season of restoration.
Yeah,
Well, it's also
lots
kind
of
of
good
interesting
information.
too, because sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I was just saying lots of good information. That's it.
It's just so interesting because I guess I look at this with what you're saying about Joseph's wife and that and seeing such a symbolism with Emma Smith, because she had dark hair and she had a lot of French background too. She had probably almost full Gentile blood, honestly. And then you have Joseph as the Ephraimite that is married to her, and there's even stories and symbolism within the life of Joseph and Emma that I feel like is very symbolic. We're seeing this once again same pattern of, I don't know, just the typology of the man and the woman and all of that, even into their lives. So that's really cool. This Gentile and Jew
I like
marriage.
how you pointed out Emma too, because remember last year when we did section 109, and I bring this up all the time because this was like such a epiphany for me, but I love how in section 109 in this Kirtland temple dedication prayer that was revelation given to Joseph Smith by God's the writer of this prayer. And you see him in, I think it's starting in verse 68, he goes through and he explains how this covenant is going to roll forward from Joseph and Emma to their immediate connections, and then to the prophets and apostles and their immediate connections, and then the church and their immediate connections. And that is exactly what has happened. That is exactly how the gospel has rolled out over the last 200 years and how it continues to roll out. And I feel like we might be in that phase where the daughter branches are reaching over the wall and we're about to have baby Zion. We can only hope.
There's also this thing I've been thinking about lately about how Rachel died in childbirth, trying to give birth to Benjamin. And if Benjamin is related somehow to the Middle East and what's going on there, there's also this theme of, we know that in is it Revelation where the two prophets are dragged through the street and there's a death there that
Yeah, I think it's
occurs. And
chapter 11.
yeah, and so I've been wondering lately, this is something I'm trying to study and get some information on, how those two kind of connect together a little bit. And, see, like, I feel like understanding Benjamin could be the very key to helping us understand what is yet to come in this next little bit. Because the story of Benjamin, you have also this idea that, I mean, what was put in his sack? I mean, all of the 10 tribes, they had gold put in every one of their sacks, and you can think of gold as gold plates or scriptures, lost scriptures. But then in Benjamin's sack specifically was placed the divining cup that Joseph used to divine with. And there's also like a sacrament motif there, because what makes bread?
Or the
Grain.
bride motif with the
Yeah.
cup, right? They're
Right.
drinking of the cup.
Exactly. And the grain in the sack, that is going to be used to make bread. And the cup is going to be filled with wine. And so once again, we see like this sacrament motif with Benjamin and what is to be fulfilled eventually with Benjamin. I will drink wine with you in the kingdom of my father. Again, DNC, what is it, 27, verse 5, that mentions that he will drink wine with us again. I don't know. Sorry, there's so many things. My mind is like going
Yeah, and
crazy,
20,
blowing in so
13,
many directions.
What it reminds me of, Rachel, is
13 is also about the priesthood and like this being the church.
just
Right.
because Egypt's on the mind, in the movie The Mummy, where he's like, "What's up with you and curses? Curses here, curses there." In my mind, I'm like, "What's up with you and motifs? Motifs here, motifs there." Like,
I didn't
there's
used
so
to be
much.
that way.
There's so
but
much of it.
I didn't used to be that way, but I'm going to tell you, it was studying Isaiah. That is what changed me. It's all the stuff that I shared with you. I started with Isaiah Made Simple, and it just it did make it simple. It did help me. I started to see how this is how God teaches. He does it in the temple too. If the temple is like our school of learning, there's tons of motifs happening there.
Yeah, which is so fascinating because, like, even though these are attempting to teach a historical narrative, I mean, that's not the point of scriptures, is to track the history. But this is how they passed on their traditions, and all of the symbolism is by attaching it. Like this
Right.
this Come Follow Me is 8 chapters long. We've only really discussed from 47 to 49, really, and how much symbolism is packed within those 3 verses. And again, I'll say this again because I said this earlier at the beginning of the year. If all you're doing is waiting for your gospel doctrine class to teach you all that there is to know about the Old Testament, you're going through 37 chapters every 2 weeks. That is an unbelievable amount of weight you're asking the gospel doctrine teacher to stuff you full of. They have an hour to go through 37 chapters. We're going, what are we at? We're at like just over an hour and 10 minutes. And we're barely scratching the surface of 3 chapters. Like,
well, and I'm having to scroll through all these cool slides that we don't even have time to talk about, like this
exactly.
one. Cool Doctrine and Covenants, Old Testament connection right there.
It's too much.
Motifs. It's in the motifs.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you need to tune in every Tuesday evening at 7:30 p.m. Pacific time and 8:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So
we've been working hard, guys, for you.
Looking at so many of these slides, Jessica, I'm astounded at how many of them match the slides that I gave to my Sunday school class. Because this idea of the fulfillment, or the prophecy and fulfillment, you've got that 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, where it's like you have the prophecy given and then the prophecy playing out. And
Right.
so it is interesting too, because we've got the 7 dispensations, going on too. I don't know, it's interesting.
So here's
I want to make an interesting parallel.
Share all your final thoughts.
I want to make it, this will be my final thought, because I think this is a very interesting parallel. When it's interesting that it describes a famine in the land. Joseph of Egypt interprets Pharaoh's dream. And the dream, this is what we talk about back in the previous Come Follow Me. But I think it's relevant here because Joseph of Egypt interprets Pharaoh's dream that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, and to bring into the storehouses so that all of Egypt would not suffer, and those around Egypt. Now, you have to understand the context, because Egypt was the world power at the time. It was the center of art, of science, of astronomy, of written language, of human intervention. It was everything. It was a world power of its time. And then there's this famine. And what happens? Joseph's family comes to Egypt to receive sustenance because of the famine. And then they receive a land of inheritance. Now, when Lehi is called to take his family through the wilderness to the promised land, they're coming out of a place of destruction, a place of famine, because they're coming into their own land of inheritance. What was going to happen with regards to the apostasy? There was going to be a famine in the land of hearing God's word, and the restoration is going to bring back. And so there's this symbolism, this pattern that we keep seeing show up. It parallels everything about the restoration. And so it just, the more I study, the more it is that we see what God has put into play and planned for us with regards to how we come to know him and understand him and receive not just salvation, we receive the blessings of exaltation through these stories, through these motifs. And this is not something that we're just pulling out of air. This is where we get into the knit and grit of studying the scriptures and understanding them, and realize this is the gospel. This is the whole point of the plan of salvation, is to bring us out of lands of destruction, out of places of famine, out of places of despair, out of places of betrayal, so we can then ascend into a place of blessing, a place of inheritance, of receiving what is in store for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just something really quick that I wanted to talk about, and before, but so Genesis 48 is when Joseph is able to bring the Israelites and they settle Goshen. Goshen is in Egypt, and it's a place there, and so that they think of it this way: in an ancient Israelite context, deities were regional and they had territories. This is the Egyptian province inviting the children of Israel into their lands, which, if you think about it from a deity level of region, they have invited the God of Israel onto their land, and there's a hospitality kind of idea there. And it's not until it talks about in Exodus chapter 1, I know this is a little bit ahead, but it says that, and there arose a new king and who did not know Joseph. And what this does is it creates this scenario where the Egyptian gods have overstepped what they've done. They've broken the covenant with the God of Israel. And this allows Jehovah to now exercise his wonders within the land of Egypt, at least from an ancient Israelite context, right? And this is where we get from Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 from the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, that El Elyon gathered the B'nai Elohim, or the sons of God, and gave them their inheritances. And to Israel was given, and unto Jehovah was given Israel. Well, being invited into this land, this is why you have in like something like Psalms 82, it talks about the death of these other gods, and why Jehovah is allowed to show his superiority to the Egyptian gods inside of their own land. This would be very unusual, but Genesis 48 actually sets that up as a possibility of deliverance because the Egyptian gods have broken their covenant with the God of Israel. And now the God of Israel can assert his superiority in their land. It's this very cool cultural dynamic of how they would have understood this story.
Right. The late Dr. Michael Heiser actually has an episode on the Naked Bible podcast regarding what you just said, that when you look at the 10 plagues, it was a challenge to each god of Egypt, because each plague represented a god, one of the gods of Egypt. And it was
that's cool.
Yahweh going against destroying the gods of Egypt one by one.
Mm-hmm. So on that note, by the way, then this is kind of where my studies have been through my Come Follow Me journey. Genesis chapter 1 is actually the retelling of a Babylonian myth that we found on what's called a tablet called the Enuma Elish. And it is Jehovah again using and repurposing and accommodating the Babylonian myth to assert his own superiority over the Babylonian, which is where this would have come from, is the Babylonian exile. And the Egyptian story with Moses is the God of Israel again asserting his superiority over the Egyptian gods. Jonah, the deity of Nineveh, was a giant fish called like Onitis or something like that. So why did Nineveh accept Jonah as a prophet and immediately start repenting? Because they saw their God spit up a prophet pronouncing Yahweh as the God. So there's this story. There's this the God of Israel is constantly repurposing the stories of the other deities of their time to assert his own superiority, and that's why in Isaiah he can say, "There is no other God before me. I am incomparable to all of these other deities. They're nothing to me. They cannot save you. You are my covenant people." And to show that, I'm going to use all of their gods to show you the stories that you would have been familiar with. So super, super fascinating. And then it even goes into Daniel with the casting of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire. And they see the God of Israel in the fire with them, which is kind of a taunt to the Nebuchadnezzar's God. So it's just this fascinating thing that you'll find throughout the Old Testament. And it all sets up here in Genesis chapter 48. So I know that was a little bit of a rant, but I had to put that in there because it sets it up perfectly.
With what you just said, so I'm pulling it up because it's about the unveiling.
Of course
Jehovah
you do.
does this, right? He unveils himself over and over and over again to whoever he can, and he meets them where they are. So think about in the Book of Mormon when Ammon is preaching to King Lamoni, and King Lamoni, he asks him if he's familiar with God, and King Lamoni is like, well, I know about this great spirit. And Ammon's like, great spirit,
It's
let's
him.
start right there. And so then he goes and he builds on that. And you guys, this is that unveiling. So like in this story, there was that whole unveiling moment. That was the center of the chiasm, right? On that other slide that I showed you. Well, even in the Apocrypha, in the story of Jubilees, there's actually a really cool part where it gives you a little bit more beautiful part of the story, and it reminded me of conversing through the veil with the Lord. Okay, like that is what it reminded me of in the temple, like the pinnacle of the endowment that leads to this great eventual like eternal marriage and the sealing, and like think about the ascension and all of that. And this is in the Joseph story. The center of his story, the center of the chiasm, is when Joseph reveals himself, who his true identity is to his brother. And just like we lost our identity's been veiled, the church's identity is veiled. The church needs to come out of obscurity and become well known in the earth. These are two of the signs of the times. And this Joseph story, I think, speaks to that process, what it looks like, how the church does that. You see the church, we have not just missionaries going out and apparently sister missionaries reaching beyond the walls, but we also have the charity, the humanitarian service, all of these different programs and things that the church does to try to fill this prophecy and to try to live up to the covenants that we've made as a people. And we have to model that. Like, it's one thing for our prophet and apostles to do these things and utilize the tithing funds and do these things through that collective, but it's another thing for us to individually become these people, to live this kind of life that Joseph lived, to be able to be the kind of forgiving, loving, wise, pure person of integrity and honor, and someone who will do the work. I mean, Joseph worked in every situation he was in. When he was in the prison, he worked so hard that they actually put him in charge of the prison. There's a whole Jesus motif right there. When Jesus goes to the prison and preaches to the captives, I mean, look at section 138 of the Doctrine and Covenants, okay? And then go back to Joseph in Egypt and the time he spent in prison and see what I'm talking about, because it's there. Like, this guy is it, okay? Like, this is the type of Christ, and he is such a model for who we need to be, especially if you know your true identity. If you know that you are a child of God and a child of the covenant and part of the house of Israel, then you need to act that way. Because if you don't, you'll be cut off like a branch that's producing bad fruit. And we want to produce the good fruit that Joseph did. We want to be doubly fruitful and have fruitful boughs.
And also, here's the interesting thing, going back to the meaning of the names. When you look at the story of Joseph and look at the names, I actually sent you a picture just now on Messenger about some of the discoveries that I made about the names of where all of the story of Joseph happens. And it, I don't know if you're able to pull it up or not really quick, but basically, like the first name that you have is, oh gosh, it had it just right up here, and then here, let me get it. Because the names, they actually give that same story of what you're talking about. Shechem is, no, that's the first one. That's the second one. So the first one is Hebron, and that means fellowship. We were once with a fellowship of God. Shechem, we had a burden to bear. And then Dothan, so Shechem is the place where that he was supposed to go. Joseph was supposed to go to find his brothers, gathering the sheep and contending the sheep, but they weren't there. They were in Dothan, a party city, and Dothan means concealed judgment. It's like kind of like Vegas, the place to go to party. Gilead is where the Ishmaelites came from to go get him out of the pit. And then Egypt, the name Egypt means narrow place. So I sent you that slide, and so you can look at that really quick
Yeah,
if you
I'll
want
try
to,
to
or
pull it up
another
really
time.
quick. Let me grab it.
Because it's fascinating when you look at the story of Joseph, that even the meaning of the names of the cities that were mentioned in this whole narrative matches that whole creation, fall, restoration motif. And I don't know. It's just it's really cool to see. Yeah, if you pull that up, that you can kind of see that story truly is a type of Christ, and even Joseph Smith too. Like if we're talking about pits, that because it was in Dothan that he was put into the pit, and all of us fell into this pit that we call mortality. Yeah, right here. That's the slide that I showed to my Sunday school class this weekend. But you look at like Joseph, where he was put in a prison pit because Liberty Jail literally was a pit in the ground that was walled like a prison. So I don't know. It's cool because we have it as a archetype of Christ, and
Nice
it's an
picture.
archetype of Joseph Smith, who is an archetype of Christ. So it's double. We've got Joseph and Joseph on both sides of the dispensations with Christ right in the middle of them. Like, come on, what is really being said here, So.
I like that. That's really funny. Good one. Good one. Yeah. So, you guys, there's so much in these chapters. And I really think that as Latter day Saints, we really need to study these stories in Genesis. The whole book of Genesis is really a lot to do with the covenant that's been restored. It's an everlasting covenant, it's an ancient covenant. Like to Monty's point, these stories, if you do not know them and you do not understand them, then you don't understand the covenants that you've made. And I think that in order to understand fully what the church is, what your role in the church is, what your role in your family is as a mother and a father, you got to look at these stories because they'll teach you about this covenant. What is the everlasting covenant? It's right here in Genesis.
Well, and just kind of piggyback off that again. I am constantly reminded going through Genesis of when I got my patriarchal blessing. And my grandfather was the one who gave it, and he spent nearly 3 hours talking about the Abrahamic covenant, talking about the responsibilities of each of the 12 tribes and the promises there. And like, it only just barely scratched the surface. I could have sworn he went through the entire book of Genesis, but no, it just barely scratched the surface of what the Abrahamic covenant was. But that's what this entire first book is about. From the creation period through Joseph, and is about the covenant that the Lord has made with his people, with Abraham on down. And so what we get to see is how that covenant plays out. How are people going to accept that, and how they're going to continue to move forward with it? What kind of penalties are there for breaking that covenant? We're going to see that a lot happening. We got a little bit of a peek at some of those who were covenant breakers in Genesis, but we've got a lot more coming.
Whatsoever man did is no
evangelical
crime.
brothers to see, or evangelical brothers and sisters, if they would just see this in the Bible, like, come on, you can realize the gospel's true. You don't even need to read the Book of Mormon. It's right there in Genesis.
They can only do a plain reading of the text, okay?
Rachel and Jess, they haven't done just a normal reading of the text.
Yeah, they claim to have done a plain reading, but
oh, I wish.
No. Just no.
You have to actually read it through once before you can.
And they even though they have like Bible Hub and Blue Letter Bible and all that, they must not read it because it's like right there.
No, they don't have that.
Anyway. I'll bet you we use it more than they do.
Yeah.
Oh, I guarantee you they
true.
Guarantee you. So, I mean, like a lot of the things that you brought up, like things relating to the bride and the breast motif that you were talking about throughout this entire excursion through Genesis. I mean, it's all over the place. It's going to be all over the place in throughout the rest of the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh. But the concept here of, again, covenant making, covenant keeping. There's a reason why it's called cutting the covenant, and why the circumcision is part of that cutting of the covenant. And so we need to recognize that while cutting the covenant doesn't look the same today, the temple motifs, the just everything related to the promises that we have been given, even if we may not necessarily be blood descendants of Jacob, we have been grafted into the house of Israel. What responsibilities do we have? Go back to Genesis 49. It outlines a lot of the responsibilities and the blessings that are there. Modern revelation has clarified a lot of that. So the question is, regardless of which tribe you are in, because each patriarch can testify that they have given a patriarchal blessing to at least one of each of the houses of Israel. You have your responsibilities. How well are you fulfilling them?
Well, and Joseph's name, I think, signifies this because it's to do again, to add, to
Mhm.
increase. And what are you to do again? You're supposed to do what the fathers and the mothers before you did to keep the covenant.
And if you are of the Josephite tribe in particular, what kind of pull have you been feeling in the last few years? What kind of responsibilities do you have as part of a Josephite tribe, be it Ephraim or Manasseh? What are you doing to fight for the gospel, to stand up for the gospel, to spread the gospel, to gather Israel as is your responsibility?
Or like Manasseh's name, to bear, to carry, Ephraim, double fruitfulness, a fruitful bough, reaching beyond. I
Right.
mean, that's our role.
Yes. And what are we doing to redeem the Jews? What are we doing to redeem Judah? That is our responsibility.
And bring Benjamin.
And bring Benjamin, exactly.
Bring Benjamin, yes.
So
Bringing Benjamin sounds like Breaking Bad, but bringing Benjamin, I
no,
don't know.
there is actually a
Should be a
band
That was
called
like
Breaking
my
Benjamin.
dream,
I was thinking
Rachel.
Breaking
I'll have to
Benjamin
tell
also.
you privately. I'm not going to say it on here.
Oh,
but
sure.
That was like my dream.
Interesting.
Right on.
Huh. This has been fun.
Now, that was a good one, guys. Okay, everybody, leave your comments.
It's
Enjoy
always-
this next
Genesis in the
week.
book for 2026. That's Genesis in the can. So next week we start the rest. We start Moses and the long story regarding him and the remnant and the houses of Israel there, and what
Right.
has been allotted to Yahweh. Anyway, any other final thoughts? I just gave mine. So
No,
Nope.
I love it. I have a testimony of the Restored Church, guys. Like, this is it. Joseph, this is it.
100%.
right on.
Yes.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and end it here, everybody. Thanks for coming, joining us. Come back next week, 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time, 7:30 Pacific. For those of you on the East Coast, I'm sorry, we're not changing. But we'll see you all next time. Have a good one.
Have a good
Night.
one.
Bye.